proposals that would formalize the long-held traditional factors that we all look at when these districts are drawn of population, minority rights, contiguous communities, and compactness. We also know that there are a lot of people who want to add into that some formal formula that factors in competitiveness. But again, I think that these traditional standards and these inputs and these values that we seek have been fairly well protected over the years, defined by the courts over decades. And what I don't want to do is take a sledgehammer to the apportionment process that, again, is created by, driven by, and executed by the people through their elected representatives, and replace it with some unaccountable, unelected group that has these factors in place that they have to consider, and not necessarily the will of the people through the ballot.
Thank you, Kevin. Prior to this year, I chaired the Senate State and Local Government Veterans Affairs Committee for 3.5 years, and obviously developed quite an interest in election laws and campaign issues. And this proposal before you is very similar to one I had last session, SJR 6. And the only difference is that SJR 6 also included for this new apportionment board to draw the congressional lines, whereas that's done by the legislature. Under SJR 4, that provision has been taken out. So the two key things, as Kevin mentioned here, is that we would increase the apportionment board from its current 5 to 7 people, and would require a supermajority of 5 votes to approve any legislative reapportionment plan. As you know, the apportionment board by statute can only meet once every 10 years. So once you draw the lines, you have those for the next 5 subsequent sessions. Congressional lines, because they're a statutory act, can be redone basically the time the legislature would deem to do that. I guess the thoughts I would have on this thing here is that we all know that 4 years ago we had a series of citizens and districts known as Iran issues that would done many things, including the drawing of legislative lines here. And I would attribute the reason that those issues failed is that the more complicated they got and the more new ideas introduced, it was a lot easier for people to be no votes on those. This resolution obviously would put this issue before the voters, and I personally think that keeping a familiar concept, that is the apportionment board, and expanding on this and improving it would be a lot easier to explain and subsequently get approval by the voters. Now, speaking for myself, I find the current process to be flawed from a standpoint is that next year's elections, as we know going in here, all that matters is who's elected governor, auditor, and secretary of state. And I think that we ought to be electing people in those positions to be able to do those jobs, and not who's going to be sitting at the table drawing lines. That certainly is a primary job of theirs, but should that be the sole focus of why we would support this. But going back to the Iran issues in 2005, at that time, a lot of groups who were to the left of the political center were advocating we do this, and the Republicans were against those issues. And then in 2006, after the elections, there was some interest by Republicans to reform the process, and Democrats were then skeptical of Republicans' intentions and whatnot. Let me suggest to you that right now, that both political parties and all those involved in this should understand that we have got the most level playing field we're going to have. And that is, right now, we assume that Governor Strickland, a Democrat, will be running for re-election to governor. One would assume that Mary Taylor, a Republican, would be running for re-election to auditor. Right now, we have no identified candidates for Secretary of State since Jennifer Brunner decided to run for the U.S. Senate. Therefore, it's a level playing field that yet the Republicans and Democratic parties can come together to reform this process. They both have the same things to gain. They also have the same to lose. Just like this week, again, with all the basketball games going on, whichever team you want to bet on, you're going to win or lose. If we don't reform the process, both political parties right now run the risk of next year being mad at themselves the day after the election, saying is we should have grabbed reform when we could have, because if the current method stays in place, all that matters is who wins 2 of those 3 seats. And if you assume that both incumbents were to get reelected, it comes down to who gets elected Secretary of State as far as which party draws those lines. When I came up with this concept of having the board go from 5 to 7, Kevin, believes that the people drawing the line should be accountable to the voters. I am not in favor of having anybody of an appointed capacity. That's not my preferred way of having people of appointed capacity to draw lines. Everybody's going to have some political bias or agenda, no matter which groups they might represent. At least those 7 people under this proposal are elected in some capacity by the voters of Ohio, and as such will be accountable to those voters. But I also think that by requiring a supermajority of 5 votes, that unless one party runs the tables, there has to be compromise put together. Now, it's been said in the past that elections is when voters choose their office holders, apportionments when office holders choose their voters. And we want to make sure that for those people who are suspicious about how lines are drawn, that there is a fair process, that anybody can submit a plan. Any group can submit a plan here. This board would be charged with the business of drawing lines to meet federal law and also any state constitutional and statutory obligations. But it would take 5 of the 7 people there to pass a plan. And we think that you can make this thing a very simple process by having fairness drawn into the districts at a time, rather than trying to worry about things like geographical compactness or trying to, however you want to draw the lines there. I think we ought to need to keep a simple process and to make it explainable to the voters here. But I think the voters here are looking for reform in the process, making sure that elected officials, particularly legislature, are accountable to them at a general election. Regardless of which party right now draws the lines, one can argue that certain partisan advantages can be drawn that favors one party or another, and usually the person who wins certain seats is decided at the primary. And that's not when we have the most voters coming out. What we're trying to do is make sure these districts are truly competitive at a general election.